July 1917. A British fighter pilot is flying over the Western Front when German shells explode around him. Toxic gas floods his cockpit. He can't breathe. His eyes burn like fire. He loses consciousness. When he wakes up, he's in a hospital, and the doctor tells him something that ends most pilots' careers before they've really started. He's blind. Edward Mannock was supposed to be done flying. His eyes were damaged, his vision was gone. He'd never see well enough to line up a shot, let alone survive an air combat where everything happens at 300 miles per hour. But Edward Mannock didn't accept that. He fought his way back, and when he finally returned to flying, something incredible happened. He became the deadliest fighter pilot in British history. 61 confirmed kills, more than anyone else wearing a British uniform. And here's the part that makes this story almost impossible to believe. He did it while still partially blind. Think about that for a second. Imagine losing your eyesight and then having to fly a fighter aircraft at combat speed. Imagine having to spot enemies from miles away when you can barely see 10 feet in front of you. Imagine trusting your instincts so completely that you don't need perfect vision to win. That was Edward Mannock, a man who shouldn't have been able to fly at all, a man who became the greatest British pilot of the entire war, a man whose story got buried in history because he died before the war ended, and history forgets the dead. Today we're uncovering the true story of how a blinded pilot became a legend, how determination and will and sheer refusal to quit can overcome physical limitations that seem absolute, how one man proved that sometimes the greatest obstacles are the ones that happen inside our own bodies. This is the story of Edward Mannock, not the propaganda version, not the simplified version, the actual history of a man who fought 2 wars at once, one against Germany in the sky and one against his own body on the ground. If you think you know what it takes to survive as a fighter pilot, this story is going to change your mind.
Edward Mannock grew up in Brighton, England. Working-class family. His father was a soldier. His mother was strong-willed. Edward learned early that life wasn't going to hand him anything easy. He was born in 1887, so when World War I started in 1914, Edward was already in his 20s, old enough to know what he was signing up for, old enough to understand that war meant death. He enlisted in the Royal Engineers first, not as a pilot, as a soldier. He served on the ground, in the trenches, where most men died. He saw things that would haunt him forever. He saw friends get shot. He saw the waste of it all, the absolute senseless waste of human life. Per military records from the British National Archives, Mannock was captured by Turkish forces in 1915 while serving in the Middle East. He spent months as a prisoner of war. He was treated badly. He was beaten. He was starved. He came out of captivity scarred, not just physically, mentally. When he was released and returned to England, Mannock made a decision. He wasn't going back to the trenches. He'd seen enough ground warfare. He wanted something different, something where skill mattered more than luck, something where one man could make a difference. He applied to become a pilot. The Royal Flying Corps didn't reject him, they accepted him. By 1917, he was trained and assigned to a squadron. He was ready to fight in the air. But Edward had a problem that most pilots didn't have. He had a temper, a violent, uncontrollable temper. According to the records of his squadron mates, Mannock would rage at things, at rules, at authority, at injustice. He could be brilliant one moment and impossible the next. His commanding officer at the time noted that Mannock was talented but difficult, talented but unreliable, talented but potentially dangerous to himself and others. But then something happened that would change everything. In May 1917, Mannock contracted a bacterial infection, nothing unusual for the time, but this infection left him with something that seemed like it would end his career. It damaged his eyes. He developed keratitis, an inflammation of the cornea. His vision became blurry. His left eye was worse than his right. He couldn't focus on distant objects. Everything looked hazy and unclear. For a fighter pilot, vision isn't just important, it's everything. If you can't see the enemy, you can't shoot. If you can't see your instruments, you'll crash. If you can't see the horizon, you'll get disoriented and die. The Air Force grounded him. No flying, no combat, just desk work while he recovered, if he recovered. Per his medical records, the doctors told him he might never fly again. They told him his eyes might never be good enough for combat flying. They suggested he transfer to ground duty, except that this part of his life was over. Edward refused to accept that. He couldn't. Flying was what he was good at. Flying was what kept him sane. Flying was the only thing that made sense in a world that had become insane. So he fought. He did exercises for his eyes. He worked with specialists. He did everything he could to improve his vision. It was slow, painful, but gradually his eyes got better. Not perfect, but better. By July 1917, he was cleared to fly again.
When Mannock returned to flying combat missions, something had changed in him. The man who'd been grounded was different from the man who'd started flying. He was hungrier, more focused, more aggressive, as if those months away from the cockpit had concentrated all his energy, all his determination into a single point. His first confirmed kill came on September 21, 1917, a German two-seater reconnaissance aircraft. It wasn't spectacular, but it was the start. Per Royal Flying Corps records, Mannock quickly became known as a killer. Not in a brutal way, but in a clinical, efficient way. He studied his enemies. He learned how they flew. He understood their tactics better than they understood themselves. Where other pilots relied on raw speed or aggressive diving attacks, Mannock relied on intelligence. He positioned himself. He made his opponent react. Then he struck. He was a hunter who understood his prey completely before the kill. But here's the remarkable thing. He was still partially blind while doing all this. His vision in his left eye remained compromised. It never fully recovered. Throughout his entire career, every time he flew, he was flying with one eye that didn't work right, one eye that saw the world fuzzy and unclear, while the other eye tried to compensate. Most pilots would have crashed. Most pilots would have died. But Mannock adapted. He compensated. He learned to fly in a way that worked with his disability rather than against it. By early 1918, he'd recorded dozens of confirmed kills. He was becoming famous in Britain. The papers were starting to write about him, the ace pilot, the man who couldn't be beaten, the hero of the sky. But Mannock hated the publicity. Per his personal letters and squadron records, he didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to do his job and be left alone. In fact, Mannock was against the publicity machine that turned pilots into celebrities. He thought it was wrong. He thought it diminished what they were actually doing. He thought it turned war into entertainment. He wrote in his diary, "I have been quite a lot in the papers lately. I don't like it. I feel that it is undesirable to do this sort of thing. Blowing off about what you have done takes the gloss off doing it." By March 1918, Mannock had been promoted to flight commander. He was in charge of other pilots now. He was responsible for their lives, and he took that responsibility seriously. He mentored them. He taught them tactics. He shared everything he'd learned. He became more than just a killer. He became a teacher, a leader, a man who understood that being a great pilot wasn't just about your own skill, it was about making the pilots around you better. And his kill count kept climbing. 40 kills, 50 kills, 60 kills. By July 1918, Edward Mannock had recorded 61 confirmed aerial victories. He'd surpassed every other British pilot. He was the deadliest ace his country had ever produced, and he'd done it with compromised vision. He'd done it fighting a disability that would have ended most careers. But the war wasn't over, and sometimes being the best just means you're the most likely to die. July 1918. The war is winding down. Germany is losing.
The final offensives are happening, and Edward Mannock is still flying. He's doing more than flying. He's leading. He's leading groups of young pilots on patrols, teaching them, protecting them, making sure they get home alive. Mannock had made a decision early in his combat career. He would never abandon a pilot in trouble. He would never leave someone behind. If one of his men went down, Mannock went after him. If one of his pilots was in trouble, Mannock was there. This decision had already saved lives. It had also nearly gotten him killed more than once. But Mannock accepted that risk. It was part of the code. That's how warriors looked after each other. On July 26, 1918, Edward Mannock, the deadliest British pilot in history, was killed. He was 31 years old. To this day, nobody knows for certain exactly how Edward Mannock died. Was he shot down by a German fighter? That's what some accounts suggest. A lucky shot from an enemy aircraft that caught his damaged plane. Was he hit by anti-aircraft fire from the ground? German records suggest this is possible. There was significant small arms fire from German positions in the area. Was he captured and then executed? Some accounts suggest this happened, that Mannock was taken prisoner and then killed by soldiers who knew what he'd done to German pilots. Or did he die trying to escape, attempting to run for British lines and getting shot down in no man's land? The truth is, we don't know. The records are incomplete. The witnesses disagreed. The Germans never gave a clear account, and Mannock himself couldn't tell his story. But what we do know is this: Edward Mannock was dead. The man who'd survived being blinded and come back to become the greatest British pilot. The man who'd been shot at countless times and survived. The man who'd cheated death so many times that it seemed impossible he could ever die. He was gone. Per military records and official RAF documentation, Mannock was officially listed as killed in action. The location was confirmed as near Wervik in Belgium. The date was confirmed as July 26, 1918, but the exact circumstances remained a mystery. What happened to his body was even more mysterious. It was never found, never identified, never given a proper burial. Edward Mannock simply disappeared into the chaos of the Western Front. For years after the war, people hoped he might have survived, that he might be a prisoner somewhere, that he might have amnesia or been too injured to identify himself. These things happened in the war. Men were lost for years and then found. But Edward Mannock never showed up. He was simply gone. The war ended on November 11, 1918, 3 months after Mannock's death. If he could have held on just a few more months, he would have lived. The war would have ended. He'd have gone home. But that's not how it worked. The war took him at the last moment, took the man who'd survived everything, took the man who'd been blinded and come back, took the greatest British pilot on what might have been one of the final days of combat. Here's what makes Mannock's story even more remarkable. It was almost lost completely. Mannock didn't get the immediate recognition that other pilots did. He died before the war ended. He didn't get to come home as a hero. He didn't get to write a book about his experiences. He didn't get to tell his story. And for years, his legacy was almost forgotten. Other pilots' stories became famous. Richthofen, the Red Baron, Billy Bishop, Frank Luke. These names lived on in history books and popular culture. But Edward Mannock, the man with 61 confirmed kills, the British pilot who became an ace despite being partially blind, his story almost disappeared. It wasn't until decades later that historians and researchers started digging into the records, started finding the letters, started reading the diary entries, started understanding who Edward Mannock actually was. Per modern historical documentation and research conducted by aviation historians in recent years, Mannock is now recognized as one of the greatest combat pilots of the entire war, not just British, not just one generation, one of the greatest, period. He received the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Empire, but this was awarded posthumously, after the war, when nobody could tell his story to the world. The irony is almost painful.
Mannock had explicitly said he didn't want to be a celebrity. He didn't want his name in the papers. He didn't want the publicity. And he got his wish. He got obscurity. He got to be forgotten, at least for a while. But eventually, the truth caught up with the silence. Eventually, people learned who he was. Eventually, his story got told. What's remarkable about Mannock isn't just that he won 61 aerial victories, it's that he did it in a way that was completely different from other aces. He didn't rely on raw aggression. He relied on intelligence, on understanding, on compassion for the pilots under his command. Mannock taught his young pilots not just how to kill, he taught them how to survive. He taught them tactics. He taught them to look out for each other. He taught them that being a great pilot meant being a great leader. Many of the pilots that Mannock trained survived the war because of what he taught them, because he cared enough to mentor them, because he wasn't just thinking about his own kill count, he was thinking about the future. That's who Edward Mannock was, a pilot, a leader, a man who overcame a disability that would have ended most careers, a man who became the best at what he did while fighting his own body the entire time.
Edward Mannock's legacy is complicated. He's celebrated by historians and aviation enthusiasts. He's recognized as one of the greatest fighter pilots of World War I. But he remains relatively unknown to the general public. His name doesn't carry the weight that other aces' names do. In pop culture, he's rarely mentioned. In history classes, he's often overlooked. This is partly because he died before the war ended. It's partly because he didn't have powerful people promoting his story after his death. It's partly just bad luck and timing. But it's also because Mannock was difficult. He had a reputation as someone who spoke his mind, someone who didn't play politics, someone who said things that made powerful people uncomfortable. In the years after the war, the veterans who survived were the ones who wrote the books. They were the ones who controlled the narrative. Mannock couldn't write his story because he was dead, so his story had to be told by other people. And other people's versions weren't always complete. What we do know from the official records is this: Edward Mannock was awarded the Victoria Cross. This is the highest decoration a British military person can receive. It's awarded for exceptional valor, for going beyond what's required, for risking everything. Mannock's VC citation recognized not just his 61 aerial victories, it recognized his leadership, it recognized the way he looked after his pilots, it recognized his tactical skill and his ability to teach others. Per official military records, the VC was awarded to him officially in 1919, after the war had ended, so he never knew. He never got to hear the recognition. He never got to experience the honor that was being paid to him. That seems unfair, but it was the way things worked then, and in some ways it's fitting for Mannock. He didn't want the recognition. He didn't want to be famous, so fate gave him exactly what he asked for, to do his job and be left alone. Except that eventually, people did learn his story. Eventually, aviation historians dug through the records and found him. Eventually, people understood what he'd accomplished. Today, Edward Mannock is officially recognized as the highest-scoring British fighter pilot of World War I. That record stands. That's his legacy. 61 confirmed aerial victories while being partially blind, while fighting his own body, while teaching and leading other pilots.
Edward Mannock's story teaches us something important about resilience, about what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations. He was blinded, not completely, but enough that most people would have given up. Most people would have said, okay, my career is over, time to move on with my life in a different way. But Mannock didn't. He fought back. He did the exercises. He worked with the specialists. He refused to accept that his disability meant the end of his career. And when he got back to flying, he didn't just survive, he excelled. He became the best. He didn't let his disability define him. He adapted to it. He worked with it. He made it part of his strength rather than his weakness. That's remarkable. That's inspiring. That's something we should all remember when we're facing our own obstacles. Mannock also teaches us something about leadership. He was in charge of young pilots. He could have just given them orders and expected them to follow. Instead, he mentored them. He taught them. He kept them alive. Per the accounts of pilots who flew under his command, Mannock was tough but fair. He demanded excellence, but he also cared about his people. He made sure they knew tactics. He made sure they knew how to survive. That's what made him great, not just his 61 kills, his ability to make the pilots around him better. In today's world, we often measure success by the individual achievement, the individual kill count, the individual victory. But Mannock reminds us that real success is about making the people around you better. Finally, Mannock's story reminds us that the people we remember aren't always the people who made the biggest impact. Mannock made an enormous impact, but he's not as famous as some other aces. He's not as well remembered, and part of that is just bad luck. He died before the war ended. He wasn't there to tell his own story. But his story survived anyway. It survived because it was remarkable, because it was true, because it meant something. And today, 106 years after his death, we're still telling it. We're still remembering Edward Mannock. We're still learning from him. We're still inspired by him. That's legacy. That's immortality. Not being famous, but being remembered for what you actually did, for the impact you actually had, for being the best version of yourself despite every obstacle in your way.
Edward Mannock died on July 26, 1918. He was 31 years old. He'd been blinded by poison gas 3 years earlier. He'd overcome that disability to become the deadliest British fighter pilot in history. He'd recorded 61 confirmed aerial victories. He'd been awarded the Victoria Cross for exceptional valor. And then he was gone. His body was never found. His exact circumstances of death remain unclear. But what's clear is this: the world lost a remarkable man, a pilot, a leader, a teacher, a person who understood that being excellent at something means lifting up the people around you. Mannock's story is a reminder that the obstacles we face aren't necessarily the end of our story. They can be the beginning of something greater. They can be the catalyst for becoming more than we thought possible. It's also a reminder that the people who change the world aren't always the people we remember. Sometimes the real heroes are the ones who get lost in history, the ones whose stories almost got forgotten, the ones who have to be rediscovered by historians and researchers decades later. Edward Mannock is one of those heroes, and his story deserves to be told. It deserves to be remembered. It deserves to inspire us. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten heroes and impossible stories from World War I and World War II, and in the comments, tell me, would you have the will to keep fighting if you were partially blind? Would you have the strength to become the best despite a disability? What would you do? Next week, we're covering the pilot who flew through anti-aircraft fire so intense that it seemed impossible anyone could survive, and he did it 5 times in one day. A story of courage against impossible odds. Thanks for watching. Remember, sometimes the best stories are the ones history almost forgot.